Just be yourself. We hear it all the time. But what if that advice is quietly making things worse? Because clinging to a fixed idea of who you are, your roles, your labels, your story, is exactly what traps you. The Buddha never said, find yourself. He pointed somewhere else entirely. He taught that identity isn't something you discover. It's something you do, moment by moment, through how you act. Today I'll show you what that shift unlocks, and why it changes everything. One morning, in the Nara period of ancient Japan, along a road somewhere in the heartland, a group of people worked in the mud. Some wore monks' robes, others wore the rough clothing of farmers. No nobles, no warriors, just people digging soil, carrying stones, laying the foundations of a bridge. The sky was blue, the wind dry. In the distance, the rooftops of the capital shimmered faintly, but no one was looking that way. Every gaze was fixed downward on the wet earth beneath their feet. One monk led the way, gripping a hoe, stepping into the mud first. The others watched his back for a moment, then followed in silence. No one had given an order, no one had been asked. Someone nearby was struggling, there was something that could be done, and so the body moved. That was all. This is the story of that monk. His name was Gyoki, and he would spend the next 50 years doing exactly this. Not preaching from a raised platform, not composing sutras in a quiet room, but standing knee-deep in rivers, pressing clay between his hands, watching water finally flow where thirst had been. When he died, the road he had built into the western provinces was still wet with the footprints of 10,000 people who had crossed it without ever learning his name. And perhaps that was the point. A name, after all, is just another thing to carry. His name was Gyoki. He lived from the late 7th century into the middle of the 8th, a devoted Buddhist scholar trained in the Hoso school. But he would not stay inside the temple. In those days, Buddhism in Japan was under strict government control. It was actually against the law for monks to go out among the common people and teach. The court issued repeated orders to restrict his activities, and yet Gyoki did not stop. He went to riverbanks where there were no bridges, where farmers stood stranded, unable to cross. He went to fields that needed irrigation channels dug. He went wherever ordinary people were struggling. With his disciples, he built bridges, repaired roads, dug ponds, and established free clinics where medicine was given to those who couldn't afford it. The records say he founded 49 such places across the country, most of them for people who could not survive on their own. One day a young disciple came to him with a question. "Master," the young monk said, "I have been troubled. Today again we dug earth and carried stones. But is this truly the work of someone who has renounced the world? Shouldn't our practice be reading the sutras, sitting in meditation, keeping the precepts?" Gyoki did not stop working. He kept digging for a moment, then slowly lifted his face and looked his disciple in the eye. "Do you know these words from the Dhammapada?" Gyoki quietly recited the verse. In translation, it goes like this: "By action one becomes a farmer. By action one becomes a craftsman. By action one becomes a merchant, a servant. By action one becomes a thief, a soldier. By action one becomes a priest, a king." The disciple listened in silence. Gyoki continued. After saying this, the Buddha added, "It is not by birth that a person becomes what they are. It is by action. So let me ask you, right now at the foot of this unfinished bridge, an old woman stands who cannot cross. Could you sit there reading your sutra and watch her?" The disciple had no answer. Gyoki smiled gently and raised the hoe again. Action shapes the person, which means what you do in this moment is shaping who you are right now. Your struggle isn't really about what practice looks like. It's about who you want to be. The disciple turned those words over in his chest for a long time. Then, without speaking, he reached for a hoe. The moment the cool weight of it settled in his palms, something shifted, just slightly. He couldn't have said what, only that his body had moved. That was all. Gyoki came to be called a bodhisattva by the common people. Not because he performed miracles, not because he sat eloquently before nobles and preached, but because he responded with his body to the hardships he found in front of him. That accumulation passed from mouth to mouth, and it spread. Even the court eventually relented. In 745, Gyoki became the first monk in Japan to receive the title of Daisojo. the highest rank in the Buddhist clergy. He had never sought the position. He had simply stayed among the people, and the rank had come looking for him. Gyoki died at the age of 77. Until the very end, he never closed himself inside a temple. The hoe he used in those final years, no one thought to preserve it. It was a tool, and tools wear out. But the bridges he built are recorded. Some of the ponds his disciples dug still hold water today. There is a scripture known in English as the Dhammapada. In Japanese, the Hokugyo, or verses on the law. It gathers the words of the Buddha into short poems, and it belongs to one of the oldest layers of Buddhist teaching. The verse Gyoki recited to his disciple, "By action, a person becomes what they are," comes from that text. At first it can sound simple. Try harder. Take action. Many people hear it that way and move on. But if we stop there, we miss something important. What this verse is truly saying is not what you do in some general sense. It's pointing to something deeper. What you have been doing has made you what you are today, and that is a far more unsettling question. Pause here for a moment. We often turn the question, "Who am I?" inward. We search for our personality, our nature, our essence, convinced that somewhere inside is a true self, waiting to be discovered. But what the Buddha taught points in the opposite direction. You are not something fixed and hidden inside. Who you are emerges from the accumulation of what you've said, who you've touched, what you've done, day after day. You don't have a self the way you have a name written on a document. You have a self the way a river has a shape, always moving, always formed by what flows through it. This is not the same as saying you have no self. It's saying a fixed, unchanging self was never there to begin with. And what does this have to do with suffering? Suffering doesn't arise because something is missing from you. It arises when the image of who I must be has hardened, and reality no longer matches it. When you believe I am this kind of person, I deserve to be seen this way, things should go like this for someone like me, and they don't, that gap is where suffering lives. In other words, what hurts is not your situation, what hurts is being chained to a fixed image of yourself. Gyoki's young disciple was caught in exactly this. He held a firm picture of what a monk should look like. Digging earth didn't fit that picture. The discomfort came from the gap between the image and the action. Gyoki didn't offer a solution. He didn't say, "Don't worry," or "change your thinking." He simply and quietly drew the disciple back to this. What are you doing right now? Action shapes the person. Said another way, even in this moment, who you are is not yet settled. When the Buddha spoke these lines, "By action one becomes a farmer, a craftsman," he was also challenging something political. The India of his time had a rigid caste system. Your birth determined your worth and your role. The Buddha said plainly, no, it is not birth, it is action. This is more than encouragement. It is a blow aimed at the very illusion of a fixed self. If you believe right now that you are simply this kind of person, that is a shape formed by the actions you have taken so far. It is not permanent. It is not fate. Because action continues, including today's. A man once came to a teacher and said, "I have been short-tempered my whole life. That is simply who I am." The teacher poured him tea, filling the cup until it overflowed, and said nothing. The man watched the tea spill across the table, and slowly, he began to understand that a cup does not decide its own shape, but it is not, for that reason, unchangeable. Let's bring this closer to daily life. The first scene is the workplace. After years in the same role, a quiet image can take hold without you noticing. I'm a behind-the-scenes person. I'm not someone who speaks in front of others. I'm past the age of learning new things. That self-image slowly grows edges, becomes solid. Then one day someone asks you to do something that falls outside that image, and a strange resistance rises up. That's not me. The feeling is almost physical. But think back to Gyoki's disciple. He had a firm image of what a monk should be. That image was the source of his pain. But the moment he took the hoe in his hands and felt the earth, something loosened. Not the image of monk exactly, but the grip it had on him. The action came first. The understanding came after. His body moved, and then slowly his view of things shifted. When something feels unlike you, that may be a signal that a fixed image of yourself is being shaken. The instinct to protect that image, to refuse the thing that doesn't fit, is often exactly what keeps the suffering in place. The second scene is relationships. We sometimes lock someone into an image. That person is cold. That person is always like this. Or we lock ourselves in. I'm not someone they need, and quietly step back from the connection. But the Dhammapada is reminding us, the other person too is someone who is becoming through their actions day by day. There is no fixed that person. They are shifting, just as you are. And what you say to them today, what you do or don't do, that accumulates into what the relationship becomes. Nothing will ever change is in many cases simply a way of saying, I've stopped trying. The third scene is quieter. It's the feeling at the end of the day that you haven't done enough. Parenting, caregiving, work, obligations to the people around you. The list doesn't shrink, and yet nothing feels finished. A slow weight settles in. I'm not contributing anything. I don't think Gyoki was trying to do something grand. There was a person who couldn't cross the river. He helped them cross. He did that again and again. Every single action was small, but as the Dhammapada says, it is through the accumulation of small actions that a person becomes who they are. The feeling of not doing enough is often a grief about the absence of big results. But what Buddhism asks is simpler. Today, did you move your body, even once, for someone else? That one thing is already shaping who you are today. And sometimes, the truest answer to that question arrives not in reflection, but in memory. A cup of tea carried without being asked, a door held open in the rain, a name remembered when it could easily have been forgotten. These are not small things that add up to something larger. They are already the thing itself. There is one small practice you can try beginning today. You don't need to do what Gyoki did. Building bridges, establishing clinics, most of us can't do those things. What we can do is let the heart of the Dhammapada's teaching pass through the body just once, in the life we're actually living. Here's what that looks like. Sometime today, do one thing for someone else, before they ask. It doesn't need to be significant in any way. If a colleague looks like they're struggling to carry something, carry it with them. If someone at home looks tired, quietly set a glass of water beside them without a word. If someone stumbles on the street, say something. That's enough. That is genuinely enough. What matters here is not the feeling of wanting to be kind. What matters is that the body moves. The hand reaches out before the mind finishes deliberating. Try to notice that order, body first. In the Buddha's time, monks went out each morning on their alms rounds. On the surface, they were receiving food, but it was also a practice of standing at the same level as the people they walked among. Someone offered a little food, they received it. In that simple exchange, the line between self and other grew just slightly thinner. Gyoki may have carried that same spirit into his work on the roads and riverbeds. One more thing. After you act today, you don't need to tell anyone. You don't need to write it down or look for acknowledgement. The moment an action becomes material for self-evaluation, the mind starts calculating before the next one. Is this worth doing? Will anyone notice? That calculation is what slows everything down. What Gyoki built over 77 years was not something he was showing anyone. He found what was needed in front of him, and he responded with his body. It was only afterward, much later, that people called him Bodhisattva. The action came first, the meaning came after. There is no promise that this will change things dramatically, but something may shift, quietly, the way soil changes after rain, not all at once, just enough that the ground holds a little differently than it did before. That shift may not be visible to you at first, but the person who received the glass of water will carry it somewhere, into how they speak to the next person they meet, or simply into the quality of their afternoon. And that is how it moves, not in declarations, but in small, unremarkable moments that pass from one body to another, like warmth through a shared wall. Gyoki did not set out to build a civilization of kindness. He just kept showing up at the next place where the road had washed out. When you moved for someone today, was it because you are a good person? Or did it happen the other way? You moved first, and only after, something about who you are came slightly into focus. Which comes first, the person or the action? Just hold that question gently. You don't need to answer it today. A monk once spent 3 years trying to understand compassion before he would allow himself to act compassionately. His teacher handed him a broom and pointed to the courtyard without a word. By the time the monk had finished sweeping, the question had dissolved somewhere between the first stroke and the last. The courtyard, by the way, was already clean. The compassion that moved Gyoki to serve the people is the same heart the Buddha placed at the center of all his teachings. And we explored that in a previous episode on the heart of Buddhism. You'll find the link in the description below. Gyoki died in a small temple on the outskirts of Nara. His disciples gathered around him, and it is said he closed his eyes quietly. It was not a grand passing. It was the ending of a life that had been covered in earth, a muddy end to a muddy life. But where he built his bridges, people are still crossing. In some places, the ponds he dug still carry water to the fields. Gyoki himself has been gone for over 1,000 years. Yet the actions remain. The Dhammapada says, by action a person becomes what they are. Read in reverse, it says something else. An action once taken lingers in the world for a while, even after the person is gone. The step you took today for someone, it was small, perhaps invisible, perhaps noticed by no one. That's all right. Buddhism would say, perhaps that's even purer. An action taken without an audience is an action taken cleanly. Who am I is not a question answered by looking inward. It emerges slowly and distinctly from the accumulation of what you choose to do, day after day, this moment after this moment. Thank you for being here with this story today. A farmer who never heard Gyoki's name still draws water from one of his ponds each morning before dawn. That bucket, dipped in silence, carries no memory of the hands that shaped the earth around it. And yet the water rises. Whose face came to mind while you were listening today? One story a day. In a week, your words will change. In a month, your eyes will change. In a year, the same world will look completely different.